Hello and welcome to the ERP Organizational Change Journal podcast, brought to you by Nestell & Associates. Nestell & Associates is an ERP organizational change management firm serving the private equity industry. I'm your co-host, Jonathan Donald, the founder of Invert Ventures, a change strategy firm, and I'm here with my friend and colleague, Dr. Jack Nestell, the founder of Nestell & Associates and the host of the ERP Organizational Change Journal podcast. The ERP Organizational Change Journal seeks to share expertise, insight, and create effective conversation to help guide ERP organizational change to real, measurable, and verified success, expanding what we can see so we can act in a more effective way. We seek to promote, connect, and foster relationships in the ERP organizational change community. The primary purpose of this podcast is to discuss, share, and reflect upon effective and efficient ways in which to realize ERP organizational change success. We will discuss the people, process, and technological components of ERP organizational change. This podcast is intended as a forum to study, share, and discuss ERP organizational change. It's our intention for this to be a collaboration tool and resource. We hope that you find this podcast useful as we share lessons learned, discover best practices, and explore the human elements and components of ERP organizational change. Our podcast draws on knowledge from extensive research, collaborative learning, practitioner experience of both project successes and project failures. A general review of the themes of ERP and organizational change practice, literature, and research suggests that understanding and critically having an awareness of tactics founded in principle is fundamental to ERP organizational change success. Our podcast will discuss these tactics, explore these approaches, and discover the principles that they are founded upon so that they may prove to be useful in addressing ERP organizational change challenges and risks.
Thank you, Jonathan. I'm always looking forward to fun conversations with you and our guest. As we are a podcast that desires to engage in valuable insight into the world of ERP organizational change success with interviews and roundtable talk, our guests include experts and pioneers in the field, organizational stakeholders, practitioners, and researchers. We are a discussion on any and all things ERP and organizational change. Our podcast is a platform for those seeking to share, learn, and reflect on ERP organizational change success.
In this episode, we will discuss business intelligence and ERP systems, a conversation on emerging technologies and innovative ideas with our esteemed guest, Dr. Dan OLeary. Dr. OLeary is a professor at the USC Marshall School of Business and the Leventhal School of Accounting. Dr. OLeary has published articles in Management Science, Decision Sciences, IEEE Intelligence Systems, IEE Computer International Journal of Human and Computer Studies, Journal of Communications of the ACM, and Decision Support Systems. He also serves as the editor of IEEE Intelligence Systems and the International Journal of Intelligence Systems in Accounting, Finance, Management, and is on the board of several journals. Those journals include Enterprise Information Systems, Expert Systems Within Applications, an international journal, the International Journal of Accounting Information Systems, Information Technology, Management, and the Journal of Information Systems. Dr. OLeary's research awards and accomplishments include, among many other, a few highlights. Outstanding Author Contribution 2017, Emerald Literati Network for Excellence. Outstanding Research Award 2016, Strategic and Emerging Technologies Sector of the AAA for his outstanding line of ERP research in the field of strategic and emerging technologies. And he's listed among the most prolific authors in computer science with 135 publications. Jack, I'm so looking forward to this conversation with Dr. OLeary.
Likewise, Jonathan. Thank you very much. So in this episode, we will explore and discuss some emerging technologies and innovative ideas in terms of ERP and business systems, including blockchain, exhaust data, strategy maps, signal theory model, and the idea of innovation through crowdsourcing. Some really interesting ideas. We will also discuss some of the recent issues and challenges for research needs from information systems and information technology researchers. Additionally, we will examine ERP critical success factors and what is required to make these technologies work for business. Technological advances are incredibly beneficial to organizations, but they also, one, need to solve real business issues, or two, improve current business processes, and three, certainly require appropriate people and processes in order to make these technologies a value add to organizations. Let's discuss further and explore these tools and technologies that support improved business intelligence and some of the keys of deployment for these tools and technologies in a way that's most effective and efficient for the organization. Dr. OLeary, thank you so much for being on our show today. I'm honored. I admire your work. I'm a huge fan. And as you know, a bit of a disciple of your work. So thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you so much for letting me be here.
Such a pleasure to have you on the show, Dr. OLeary.
Hey, let's dive in. Dr. OLeary, you have some interesting recent work and articles that I'd like to share out with our listeners. I'd like to present for our listeners some of the fascinating work you are doing in terms of what is ultimately contributing to improved business intelligence for organizations. So I'd like to first ask a few questions around some of this work, some of this recent work, and then we'll get into some of the ERP success factors a little bit later in the conversation. So let's start with blockchain. Recently, you published some articles, including, just to give our listeners some examples, evolving blockchain applications, multiple semantic models and distributed databases for blockchain data reuse, and some issues in blockchain for accounting in the supply chain with an application of distributed databases to virtual organizations. And one more, configuring blockchain architectures for transaction information in blockchain consortiums, the case of accounting and supply chain systems. So, Dr. OLeary, any predictions on when and if blockchain will be fully integrated into ERP or business solutions in general or in end-to-end supply chains? Can you maybe paint a picture for our listeners on what that looks like and if blockchain will fully become fruitful?
Sure. The problem is that there's so many expectations that it's just like off the chart in terms of what people are expecting out of blockchain. And in actuality, blockchain is actually just a pretty simple device. It just historically captures the transactions that occur, whatever those transactions are, puts them in order, and then at the end of the day, it basically puts it into an append only, so that a new transaction occurs, you put it onto the end of the list. And then it basically keeps those in an immutable form, so through like encryption, basically trying to keep it so that there's no change associated with it. So there's a lot of strengths associated with it that accountants just love. Accountants love the controls that are in there. You can't change it. I mean, that's just gorgeous when you look at it if you're an accountant. And if you think about it, it's nice too. You can only append, so you can't like make any changes to it. Or if you do make changes, then people are going to know that that's the case. So as you take a look at it, it's got these features that accountants just love. But on the other hand, it's got features that are not particularly good for big organizations or for people that are doing business and need to do it in real time. Because it's this sort of structure where it's just one after another, it's not really made for accessing. So querying is difficult. You can't really query to like a blockchain. You can, but it would take you forever. Basically, it would take you a long time to do that because you basically would have to sort through them. So in general, what happens a lot of times is that people take this data, if they have it, and they put it off blockchain. So you basically take it and put it into another setting, like a data warehouse or to a database, whatever the heck it happens to be. Mm-hmm. And in so doing, what you do is you lose those cool aspects that accountants love. And you have to do that if you want to really make it accessible, if you want to make it so that people can get to it. So it's an interesting sort of dilemma that you face as you talk about getting these into ERP systems or trying to integrate them with ERP systems. And then another issue that goes with it too is that as you're building them, it's ideal if you could get what's referred to as a public blockchain, which is basically an open blockchain that a lot of people have access to, and you define the approach that you're going to be using to capture your data in a very general manner typically. But what happens is that the public ones really don't work well for most business settings, and so you'll see most of the business settings use private. And as soon as you do that, then you potentially get into this issue of multiple semantic models that people have that are out there, and you ultimately can choose. You conceivably, you can be on multiple blockchains with multiple people doing the exact same thing, using and capturing different data, putting it in different formats. I think there's a lot of limitations that are in there. And as you think about it, blockchain's been around for a while, maybe about since roughly 12, 13, 14 and through there, people became aware of it. And people have been looking at it for accounting, but it's not really taken hold. It's just not there. And you sit there and you think, why is that the case? If this thing was as adaptable to accounting as you would think it would be, then you would have like a lot of different applications out there, and people would be using it a lot. It's an interesting, interesting setting like this. That as you take a look at it, you kind of think, hey, if this was so great, why aren't we using it? Why isn't it? And why are people still talking about this stuff? Why are they still talking about the opportunities? And the other thing that's kind of interesting as you take a look at this is that you'll see it where people will say, well, this is a blockchain application or blockchain app. And in actuality, blockchain may be in there, but a lot of times the really key feature is that it's a big database, and the database is nice, and you've got a good network in there, and the network is captured and interfaced to all these different people. And the blockchain is like just a relatively small chunk of it, because it's just going to be capturing that data, one transaction after another in a append-only manner, and just keeping it like that. So it's kind of interesting as you think about what some of these issues are, and you think about how you would interface it with other kinds of systems along the way. So
that's very, very interesting to me, Dr. OLeary. And it's I think if I had to summarize what you just explained for our listeners, isn't it almost there's a gap? We need to bridge the gap between making the concept of blockchain live up to its expectations versus making it actually useful, making it actually, more functional. Isn't there a bit of a gap there?
There is a huge gap. There's a huge gap. And the other thing is that there's good technologies that are in the way, that are there now. So if you take a look at a data warehouse, data warehouse, some companies have done these really cool approaches with data warehouses where they basically capture all the transaction information. So if you take a look at Cisco, SYSCO, they capture all the different transaction information from all the sales that they make. And then they basically put it into a big data warehouse, and anybody that's a customer of theirs can sign on, find out what they bought, what they have in the past, what they purchased in the past. And they've got all that data right there. So they can do business intelligence on their own data if they like. And so it's like you sit there and you go, that's a really good application. It responds rapidly because it's in big data warehouse. And so the other issue is displacing existing technologies that really do the job well. I think that's another one, another concern or question.
We had Mr. Paul Mago on, and he is with CGS, Blue Cherry Software, and he was saying the same thing. There's some challenges there between bridging that gap of what's expected versus what you can actually do technically at this point. So very interesting.
Fantastic answer. The way you put that in practical terms about is it worth really displacing good software, and what are we trying to do on an operational level with blockchain? It's just fascinating. I'm hoping you can give us that same insight in a different topic. You wrote an article with Dr. Story titled "Discovering and Transforming Exhaust Data to Realize Managerial Value." This is going to be a start of a conversation here, but can you please explain to our listeners what is exhaust data and what's the current application of the idea?
Exhaust data is actually kind of an interesting, unique topic. What happens is that if you think about companies, they basically focus on core data. So I'm going to differentiate between core data and exhaust data. Okay. And if you take a look at an ERP system, you basically, oftentimes you'll choose your ERP system because of the core data. You've got some core products that you're focused on. You've got a core strategy that you're trying to implement, and you try to align the choice of your software and the use of your software, your ERP software, et cetera, through trying to align it with the strategy for your core products and for your core data. And you generate core data as part of this whole thing. Well, the issue is, though, is that there's this thing called exhaust data. Exhaust data is sort of like what's left over if you aren't paying attention to it, or if you aren't looking for it, or if you're not sort of aware of it. And I'm going to give you an example, and it relates to accounting. If you think back to the very beginning of accounting systems, literally the beginning of like a EDP system, so to speak, a computer-based systems. So when they first started having this, they found that, what we first are doing, we're keeping track of transactions, right? The debits, the credits, that kind of stuff. You keep track of the the date. And then because it's a computer-based system, you start doing other stuff, though. You've got this other kind of information that you can keep track of. It's like who made the transaction, or where they made the transaction, or when the transaction was made. And so all of a sudden you've got stuff that wasn't around, data that wasn't around prior to the technology being there. And all of a sudden people sat there and said, hey, what can we do with this data? And if you take a look now at most accounting systems, they basically use a lot of that stuff for logs and that you're capturing this information in, and then you're using it for security purposes to sit there and go, hey, what's this funky transaction here? Who made this and when was it made, right?
Right.
But you've got that data. Initially, it was like just extra data that was just there. Nobody really paid much. And they said, hey, we can put this in there. We ought to use this stuff. And then people began to realize, this is really cool stuff. We can use it. And so the initial data was, and the core data was basically the transaction information associated with it and the customer. But then this extra data, this exhaust data, this extra stuff out there, it all of a sudden, it was something that became important. And it now has become core. And so you have this sort of life cycle of things that happen where you'll have a technology comes in and it has information associated with it. You go into that technology thinking that you've got some core data associated with it, but then there's extra stuff. And you begin to sit there and say, what can I do with this extra stuff? And that's sort of like the creativity that comes associated with exhaust data. So you get this extra data. What can I do with it? How can I use it? And how can I be innovative with this data? So it's an interesting, really cool set of way of looking at data, sort of differentiating between what's core and then what's extra, so to speak. And that's what that differentiation is for.
That's fantastic. And Dr. OLeary, I want to push a little further here. So the accounting example is a great example of how exhaust data becomes core. Today, where do you see exhaust data right now being used to improve ERP or business solutions in terms of managerial value or better business decision making?
See, that's just it. Now, if you take a look around, then it's almost like, what data can we see? What data do we have? And so this paper basically asks that question. It says, how can I look at my data so that I can be creative about it, so that I can do other things with it? And in some cases, what it means looking for places and data that you might not have thought about already. So, for example, and you see some really cool examples of this if you take a look at things like Google searches, right? So if you take a look at Google searches, what happens is, so all of a sudden use that information about how many people were searching for something. Or if you go to Wikipedia, you might sit there and go, how many queries do we have? How many people have gone into Wikipedia on different days of the week? And so, the core data associated with, let's take the Wikipedia. The core data is just, hey, people are in there and they're looking for these different transactions. But you can begin to sit there and say, well, what might I use this for? And so, I don't know if you ever heard of the Masked Singer, but it's one of the interesting things associated with the Masked Singer is that you sit there and go, hey, let's go to Wikipedia and let's do a search on who we think this person may be. And if you go to Wikipedia, sometimes what you'll see is that they'll see that who the guest who behind the mask is. They'll all of a sudden get a bunch of searches associated with it from, say, Wikipedia or the number of searches on Google searches. And you'll see, so it's a way of saying, what do people think and finding out about what other people may think about stuff. And so you sit there and you think, okay, now how would I do this in an ERP system? What might be some of the issues? And then it would be different. You'd have to sit there and go, okay, I might be that I'm making transactions. What's the number of transactions? And what can we get information from? What does it mean if we start taking a look at information that we wouldn't normally be looking at, kind of thing? So it's a really interesting concept that's out there, and I think it's got a lot to tie into innovation and how companies can innovate. Can I get another example in there? A lot of times what you'll see is it's like, especially like in social media, people will be in a position where they can disclose things. You go up to Facebook or whatever the heck it happens to be, any of your social media, Twitter, any of those kinds of things. And what you'll see is that people will say more than they probably should. You see this example sometimes where people will say, I'm out of town. There's a famous boxer was in China. And so he had a big Twitter tweet, I think it was, that said, hey, over in China, really enjoying it, and had a picture of him on the Great Wall of China. Well, as it turns out, somebody was paying attention. They saw that he was out of town and then basically went to his house and robbed his house. So the core data associated with that was just to brag and say, hey, this is really cool. I'm visiting these cool things. But the exhaust associated with that is if you're thinking about it, if you're clever, you look at the information and say, hey, I got a different way of looking at this information, and that is, he's not there, and I can use this information in a different way that will help me. Trying to look at information and find different ways of getting to that information and using it.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. OLeary. What a fascinating and cool idea, and I really wanted to share that with our listeners because it's this idea of exhaust data is pretty powerful.
Absolutely.
And especially this, I want to highlight this for our listeners, the idea that the exhaust data is the spark of innovation that becomes core data. And that's a really cool cycle.
It's a gorgeous way to look at information. It evolves over time. The use is it's like you sit there and you go, this is the information I use. This is the only stuff that's important. And then pretty soon you sit there and go, wait, this can also be important. And wait, this is really value creating.
So, Dr. OLeary, as you know, ERP organizational change often requires, almost by definition, changes in process and technology in a way that best advocates for the goals of the business, right, by improving and or implementing more and effective processes. Jonathan and I have some questions for you today where we're going to share some longer quotes, so please bear with us.
Sure.
But in 2020, you just recently here, you wrote an article titled Enterprise Architecture for Accounting and Finance Transformation, Using Strategy Maps to Develop High-Performance Finance. This was in I believe it was the Journal of Emerging Technologies in Accounting. Dr. OLeary, the article notes, quote, although enterprise architecture is evolving into multiple billion-dollar businesses, it has received limited attention in the accounting information systems literature. The article then goes on to say, the Hartford developed a strategy map and used that map as the basis of enterprise architecture integration. The process generated a creative future state that included a linear flow of information that mirrored the information lifecycle while providing a single source of truth archive for financial information in order to redesign the finance function to attain high-performance finance. In doing so, the paper investigates a unique approach and innovative practice that allows grounding accounting and financial information systems in an organization's strategy for formulation process. I think that's just fascinating and very interesting. Can you share with our listeners kind of the general summary of this article? Can you elaborate just a little bit more?
Absolutely. There's these things that Kaplan and Norton created that are called strategy maps. And basically, they're designed to help people with their strategy in the investments of people, processes, and technologies that they've got out there, typically related to the balanced scorecard. So you see, it's a nice vehicle that companies can use to manage their their intangible resources, including things like culture, leadership, and other factors that they see as important. So as a result, these maps have received a lot of attention in strategy and in management, and even a little bit in management accounting. But they really haven't gotten much attention on the system side. And so what happened was this paper evolves from discovering some information that the Hartford was doing, an approach that the Hartford had set up to use these strategy maps and figure out how they were going to be evolving their finance function. So it was kind of interesting. What they did was they start with the strategy maps, and strategy maps start out with a focus on different characteristics in the organization, and they try to get to different issues. But what they did was they broke it up into different pieces. They brought one piece into the accounting, and they said, how can we build this thing into accounting, not just into using the strategy maps at Hartford? Mm-hmm. So if you take a look at business strategy maps, they basically broke it into multiple different sections. If you take a look at strategy maps, it's a thing called the enterprise perspective, and that what you do is you figure out what your key objectives are. And then they also have the customer perspective. And so you sit there and say, what do we want? What's really important for our customer as we go through this? And then you break it into other pieces such as the internal perspective. And the internal perspective for the Hartford ended up involving 4 different characteristics. It was the customer market, the commercial market, the wealth management, and then finance. And so then the question is that when we take a look at these individual pieces, customer market, commercial market, wealth management, and finance, what can we do and how can we use these business strategy maps to basically build the next generation of accounting systems, okay? And so that's what this whole thing was basically aimed at as they went through it. And the focus is ultimately build that system to get rid of the as-is system that they have, which is just a mess. You see the paper and you see the as-is statement. As in many companies, the as-is is just a disaster. You sit there and you go, wow, what are we going to do with this whole thing? Because the systems are just linked. You've got multiple inputs to multiple systems and multiple outputs. And as a result, you don't have like a single source of the truth.
Yep.
And that, from a finance perspective, that's critical, right? As we know this. One of the key advantages as we look at things like ERP systems is to ultimately try to generate that single source of a truth.
Yeah.
And so that's what this paper does, is it basically follows through what they do and follows through on that that whole set of issues that they have that relates to them building this new system that gets them to that single source of the truth. The interesting thing is that as we take a look at this whole source of strategy, a lot of times organizations don't tie their strategy to the accounting information systems. They don't bring it through. You don't align it through to what the strategy is. And what this does, and what you see at the Hartford, is this attempt to really tie back what they do at the systems in the finance area to what is the overall strategy of the company and how that strategy trickles down into the finance department and how you use it to align your systems in accounting and finance. So in that sense, I just love what they did. It's like what I thought was a particularly innovative approach, which is why I ended up writing the case study on that.
Yeah, very interesting, Dr. OLeary. System strategy alignment is critical. So for our listeners, I'll put a reference to this article in our show notes, and I encourage you to read the article. It's really very interesting.
What an amazing example, and what an innovative project. Dr. OLeary, I want to bring your perspective to something that's a little more immediate. Everywhere I look, there's an opportunity to learn from COVID-19. Its impacts on people, on their lives, on businesses, has just been extraordinary. And I know you released a paper, Evolving Information Systems and Technology Research Issues for COVID-19 and Other Pandemics, in May 2020. I want to have you give some context on that article. Before I do, I want to share a quote with our listeners. So please bear with me. It's a little bit of a longer quote. In the article, you state, this paper examines some of the issues for research needs from information systems and information technology researchers elicited as part of COVID-19 pandemic. We investigated a number of issues, including facilitating work while social distancing, contactless commerce, personal recognition when wearing masks or in other crisis situations, COVID-19 apps and their impact on such concerns such as privacy, crowdsourcing, donating data, tracking, and etc. In addition, we examined several supply chain issues, such as changing patterns of supply and demand, fragile supply chains, and automatic supply chains. Further, we investigated a number of emerging issues and the role of data, big data, and analytics in the area of changing and evolving work and their impact on organizations and electronic commerce. Finally, we concluded with a consideration of the merging of life and work and the issues of work-life balance. Dr. OLeary, can you summarize this article and discuss the questions you raised and the implications for information systems?
This was a fun article because back in February, I was sitting there thinking, what the heck is going to happen when we get into COVID, and what are going to be some of the strengths and weaknesses? As you take a look at it, that was the overall concern with it. Sit there going, okay, well, what's going to happen, and what are some of the issues that are likely to be there? And it was interesting to see them evolve as you come along. Like one of the things that we mentioned, that we talked about, fragile supply chains. You saw that immediately. One of the first things is after the COVID virus hit, and all of a sudden little things just like finding toilet paper was like a whole nother world out there. Who would ever think that we'd be fighting over toilet paper? But sure enough, that's what was happening. And so, but this paper tried to anticipate some of those issues by thinking about what was going to happen in the supply chains as all of a sudden, if people stayed home as opposed to going to work, all of a sudden the demand is going to be changing associated with that. This was something that I also ended up experiencing myself. Was I needed a camera because we ended up going online at USC. And so I needed a camera. I didn't really have a camera prior to then. So I tried to buy a camera, and that was anybody that was trying to do that around middle of March or even into April, you probably know that it was like impossible. I still remember the time that I ordered a camera and was told that it would be delivered in beginning of May, which was when my class was going to start in mid-May. And as I got closer, I contacted them, and they said, we've pushed that back to August. And I'm sitting there going, okay, great. Oh, wow. You don't seem to understand. I need the camera. By May 15th, that's when the class starts. And so it was interesting to see just these different changes that were out there. So this paper tried to anticipate what some of those issues were that were going to be happening, and tried to get to these issues like what's involved with the resilience of the supply chain. How can we make these supply chains better so that they basically can handle being in these kinds of settings where there's just all of this uncertainty and all these changes that are occurring. There's been this issue. One thing that I've been quickly following up on was this notion of autonomic supply chains, and it's basically supply chains that try to keep and be as independent of people as they can. And so it's a really interesting issue if you can make it work. It started in the military a few years ago, probably a decade or 2 decades ago, and it continued with companies like Procter & Gamble and things like that. But it's one of those issues where you sit there and go, how can we do this? How can we make those supply chains become autonomic, which means basically function on their own, that we don't need to help them and they don't need as much people help as they would need associated with it. So that was basically the primary focus of this. Also, it was trying to anticipate things like how is work going to change as we got into this, and it's really fun to take a look at this and see how things changed and how good were we in anticipating some of these changes. Can I quickly put in this one? It's interesting. One thing that I thought would be a bigger deal that apparently was not, and that's this world of what I call vulnerables and non-vulnerables. I really thought that at some point in time that people who had been sick, who had gotten the COVID and had recuperated, would be in more of a position for doing things that were, more on the front of this. And that never materialized. But you sort of see that happening now as people get into things like the vaccine. So now they're talking about the people that have been vaccinated or not vaccinated. And the airlines are talking about how you might need a vaccination card to be able to fly in the future. So but that sort of surprised me a little bit. But you see it sort of manifesting itself to a certain extent in terms of the vaccine.
Any other big surprises that you see that you were expecting that you didn't see, or that you're shocked that you did?
One of the things that I did see that I think is really worked and that I think is becoming more and more important is this whole notion of robotic process automation. All of a sudden, when people weren't in the office, things changed because, you used to have a lot of things depend on running into people at the office, or if you had questions, going in and talking to people or finding these things out. And so what happens is I think one of the things that happened over this whole COVID is the opportunity to basically that we had to make a lot of those processes that were more informal. We had to make them more formal because people weren't in the office. I mean, you could still do it maybe by getting together on Zoom, but if you could make it formal, it would make it better because you didn't have to worry about that going down to the office or something like that. And so as a result, I think one of the things that has really grown, I think, over this whole COVID pandemic is this impact of the robot process automation. Because now you can have robots doing some of this stuff. You just have people doing it. Now people are sitting there going, hey, listen, let's just get a robot doing this stuff because I can't get into the office anyhow. And so I think that's probably making a big impact. And if it isn't, then I think it will shortly after when people come back and they go, hey, let's try to figure out a different way with the cost of people. So you see one of the interesting things is the cost of people seems to be going up over time. Here, and I'm in California, and one of the things that's happening is the increase of people in hazard pay types of settings. If you could have a robot do it, why not? You save the exposure to the disease, you save costs associated with it. So to the extent that you can see and build in these robotic process automations, I think that's something that's really got to be an important thing, if not increasingly in the future.
Very interesting work in article. So Dr. OLeary, I would like to slightly switch gears. First part of our conversation today was regarding some pretty interesting ideas in terms of emerging technology and creative and innovative ideas and research that advocate for improved business intelligence, one way or another. But now, if I may, let's talk more about ERP organizational change and the triad, right? The people, processes, and technology. You wrote a book, I believe it was published by Cambridge University Press, and actually I think to this date, correct me if I'm wrong, it was one of the most cited ERP books called Enterprise Resource Planning Systems, Lifecycle, Electronic Commerce, and Risk. And clearly technology changes at the speed of light, right? It seems that there has been significant advancement, of course, in terms of ERP systems and organizational change research. And although first published, I believe, Dr. OLeary, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think in 2000, the ideas that you discuss in this book is highly relevant today. And so the first question I have is, why investigate ERP systems? This is a topic that you discuss in the book. And why should practitioners and scholars alike, whether 20 years ago or today, spend any time, money, or effort studying the various components of ERP organizational change? What's your thoughts on that?
It's amazing to me that it's still as relevant, I think, today. In fact, it may even be more of a constraint when the book was written in 2000, it was a lot of it was just beginning to happen. It was beginning to evolve as time went on, and but I think it's even more so today because it's just something you have to have now. In those days, it was, well, do we have one? Do we have competition out there that's doing it? Because in those days, what happened was that for all intents and purposes, you might see all of a sudden somebody in your particular industry decided, well, we're going to get an ERP, and then all of a sudden they had an advantage. They had a competitive advantage, and so you had somebody coming, basically knocking on your door saying, hey, don't know how to tell you this, but your competition over here, guess what? They just implemented it. Now, we know how to do this kind of stuff, so maybe we can help you. But at that point in time, it was more like the market was just emerging and people were beginning to adopt and things like that. But it's now at the point where it's more of a constraint. I mean, you now have to have it. And the issue is now, which one do I have and how do I implement it and what's my technological environment that I put it in and all of those kinds of issues, because it's just, it is what drives it. It is what has your core data associated with it. It is what affects your strategy. It's a strategy for your company moving forward. If it doesn't, then you haven't done it right, and your strategy is potentially not going to be implemented the way you'd like to have it be able to implement it. So to me, it's like why Investigate is almost bigger now for ERP systems. It's almost more important that people become and investigate these issues and analyze what's going on with their ERP system. The other issues, can I just say this too? Now, one of the differences is that in those days, you didn't necessarily sit there and say, well, am I happy with what I'm doing now? And should I think about the next steps associated with it? Or how can I make it better? And now I think that's one of the issues. It's like, it's one thing that ought to be considered, and that is how can we evolve our systems now so that it's even better, so that it counts for what we really need to have it do. It's too easy sometimes to sit back and go, hey, this is a system, it's working and everything's fine, rather than thinking, hey, listen, how can we push this thing forward? How can we use it to better manifest our strategy here? So in that sense, I think that it's still incredibly relevant.
Absolutely.
Dr. OLeary, another thing that often comes up is this balance between business process reengineering and out-of-the-box best practice, especially during ERP organizational change efforts. What are your thoughts on this? And specifically, the technologically enabled clean slate reengineering? And what's the pros and cons of each?
It's interesting to me as you take a look at this. It's still the big issue. It's like as you go through, change your processes, right? I mean, Michael Hammer back in 1990, I think it was, is automate or obliterate. He said, don't automate, obliterate was what it was. And it was really on the money, I think. And it's like, take a look at your processes, figure out how they work. But then, but one of the interesting things is that when they did that, all of a sudden, a lot of companies were sitting there going, holy gosh, as we take a look at this, we don't know what do we put in its place. Sure, we want to get rid of these existing processes, but what do we replace it with? And that's what's really cool about the ERP systems in general, is that basically they've got that portfolio of processes that you've got in there, that you've got to basically facilitate to put those processes into play. Now, this whole notion of technology enabled is pretty interesting also, because basically what you sit there and say, hey, listen, we're going to change, and once we decide to implement the software, it basically constrains to a certain extent what you're going to do, but it also enforces and said, hey, listen, these are some of the processes that are out there. These are the good processes that are potentially available for us here. And so we can use these processes to begin to make our organization better. And that's why it's important for organizations to sit back periodically and still examine those processes and to see, does it make sense? Are we doing this right? It's just too easy to get into this is the way we've done. The exact same thing in those days when Hammer came out with his paper was that this is the way we've done it, so this is the way we continue to do it. The exact same thing happens even in today's world with the ERP system. A lot of times you might have implemented that software 10, 20 years ago, whatever the heck it happens to be, and you sit there and go, hey, listen, back then it might have been the way to do business, but now the world has just changed.
Yeah.
It's like maybe we should be thinking about a different ERP system or upgrading the system or thinking about our processes, and you should let the processes really sort of drive much of what that is, drive what needs to be done.
Yeah. So, Dr. OLeary, there are approximately, to my account, about 93 plus ERP vendors in the discrete manufacturing space alone, for instance. And I think that most people agree through research and anecdotal experience that there really is one best fit for an organization, whether it's based on functionality or business model or market data or price. It's really important that ERP selection process. What would you say to our listeners in terms of the value in choosing an ERP system? That is, how and why would you emphasize the value of the ERP selection process?
Well, as you're saying, it's critical, and that whole process is just like, how do we go through it? And that's one of the things I liked about that. To a certain extent, let me just briefly go back to when we were talking about the Hartford and we were talking about the enterprise architecture approach. One of the nice things is to sit there and go through your strategy and sit there and say, hey, listen, how does what we're doing impact what we're doing, and what are some of the key development assumptions that we should be making, and what are some of the key development approaches that we should take into account, and what are our key processes that we should be examining here, and going from there. So, for example, to go back to the Hartford for just a moment, one of the things they decided is that they decided they were going to choose software that would be, to the extent feasible, it would be software that allowed them to handle their processes without making major changes in the software. So they did not want to make changes associated with it. They were hoping that what they would do is choose a software that would meet their needs and that could evolve over time, so that when new versions of the software came out, upgrades or whatever that could happen to be, they could just basically follow along with that easily. And so I think that's really an important set of issues. Again, tying back to the strategy, then also as you think about these concerns, it's like, figure out what are the key underlying approaches that I'm going to be taking? What are the key processes? And let's monitor those processes and make sure that they're working the way that we want them to work.
Dr. OLeary, let's go deeper into this customization, and you can use the Hartford as a case study. Jack and I have been talking, and there's a ton of research around ERP software customization and where that comes from. And Jack was actually just telling me he reviewed an article just recently on this topic. So can you share with our listeners in terms, what do you see as the strategy for customization versus out-of-the-box best practice? And what are the implications on that strategy, as you said, for the strategy of the business?
Well, this is just it. It's like, and this is where, as you were talking about, it's like we need to find the right software. Because if I don't find the right software, then people are going to sit there and go, wait, this doesn't do what I need to have it do, so I need to make some changes in it, or I need to make it, and more than just, hey, my old software used to do it this way or that way. It's more like, hey, I literally can't do what needs to be done with this software. And that's why the choice process is so critical, to make sure that you choose that software correctly, right? That you find the software that's going to be out there, because you're hoping that you don't need to do the customization. And over time, this is one of those things, too. We talked about how there's this evolution when we were talking about core and exhaust data. We basically see that happening a lot, I think, with the ERP systems. So a lot of times these ERP systems started out with relatively plain vanilla approaches, but then over time you've gotten these different industry models that are available out there. And those industry models really provide a lot of the customizations built in, because at some level they basically represent what some company was out there and wanted to do associated with this, and how they wanted to build in changes that were not quite meeting their needs from the existing software. So it's an important issue to sort of follow through in terms of like the choice of software, so that choose that software that does make it to the extent that's possible. And maybe there's industry software that's out there that allows you to make that choice to meet your specific needs. And if there is, make sure you find that software. Talk to somebody who knows about this stuff that can tell you that there is software out there, rather than a lot of times companies sit there and they just depend on doing an internet search and finding it themselves. So it's really critical. And then also tie it back to what the strategy is for the organization, and also your implementation strategy. So, for example, the Hartford was very interested in this single source of the truth, and they wanted to find that. And you can see that based on that, at some point in time, they probably were facing a situation where somebody asked them what the answer was, and there were multiple answers. And when that happens, it's not a good thing necessarily, right? And so you sit there and say, how can I get around that? A lot of times the problems that companies have drive what their principles of design and principles of work are when it comes to these ERP systems.
Sure. So, Dr. OLeary, I just want to touch on success factors here a little bit more, but
sure.
In your book, you stated that, quote, not all ERP implementations are successful, end quote. And I think that held in 2000 as much as it does in 2020. And that's not to say that none are successful. I'm not saying that at all. But I think that the fact is that many encounter significant challenge. Large-scale ERP implementation to this day is a significant organizational endeavor. And I think that's well supported, again, by the value and some of the research that we're seeing today. And I think just to add, you'd mentioned to a previous question, why is the research still relevant? And I think you made a great point. It's very relevant because, number one, business systems and having that competitive advantage with accurate and timely business intelligence, it's critically important today as it ever was. Just look in the case of, I think, COVID, and I think organizations that were armed with sound business intelligence were able to maneuver in terms of the supply chain picture maybe a little better than those that weren't. But I think that for that reason, and also for the very reason that ERP organizational continues to be challenging, that's certainly driven the demand for ERP research. So the supply equals the demand. And that's usually what I tell people, why do we have ERP organizational research? Why do people care? And it's because we're trying to solve real business challenges. But in your book, you present a risk matrix in which you offer up how the entire ERP organizational change lifecycle is prone to risk, which may be technical and or business and or organizational related risk. You also describe how one or more of those risks occur at any of the ERP lifecycle phases, which include, number one, deciding to go ERP in the first place, two, choosing an ERP system or ERP selection, which we discussed earlier, three, designing, four, implementing, five, after going live and training. And so I think this matrix emphasizes a key notion, and that is that the organizations really need to be cognizant and aware of the vast array or influences, negative or positive, that can occur at any time in the process, right, of this ERP organizational change effort. Can you maybe provide a little more color to our listeners around this risk matrix and maybe just kind of take a minute to drive home that idea and that point?
Absolutely. To me, this was a key issue. And as I was writing the book, it was one of the last things that came out of the book because I wanted to have something that was sort of an organizing structure associated with the book. And as I was going through it, I was sitting there going, oh, my God, as you take a look at this, if you take a look at failures or lack of success occurring, it happens at any place in that life cycle as you go through, as you said, from just deciding to go ERP. Did we decide to go ERP for the right reason? Did we decide for the particular technological environment that we're going into? Is this going to be, we're going to have in the cloud, or where are we going to have this ERP system? All those things, every single step in that whole process, something can go wrong. And the question is that, what do we do as we go through this? We need to basically be aware that that's the case. Because companies sometimes get to the end and they go, oh, we screwed up, we chose the wrong thing. Well, it's not that they made that wrong choice at that point in time. It may be someplace way earlier in that whole process. And that's why you've got to basically monitor it as you're going all the way through each step. One step at a time, you've got to basically understand what's going on as I'm going through that whole process. Because there's any one step in there. You can pull out a list of companies that did something wrong or were seen as being wrong or something went wrong for them in that whole process. So for me, that's one of the issues is to take a look as you're looking at ERP systems. It's important to look at the value creation side to it, but it's also important to look at the downside and the risk side and say, hey, listen, everything we're doing has got risk associated with it, and how can I best monitor that risk, and what are some of the issues of concern as I go through and analyze this whole implementation from a risk perspective.
Sure. Well, Dr. OLeary, it's been a fun conversation. We appreciate your time and your insight. And so lastly, I'd like to end our conversation today with one more question. And I have a bit of a challenge question for you. So yourself and many colleagues have done some fascinating and interesting work in the field of information systems and ERP organizational change. If you think about your work, what would you offer up to the quote-unquote boots on the ground practitioners, such as myself and our firm, as advice or recommendation in terms of making technology and business systems work for organizations? So if you had to distill down your work and your passion for teaching and research, what would you offer up to me in terms of applying insight gained from your work?
That's a really, really good question, and one that is constantly the question that I'm sure boots on the ground people are constantly faced with. It's like, too often you see these things and you go, well, what's it really mean for me as we go through this? My perspective on this would be to say, don't lose your creativity. Try to keep the creativity associated with it, because sometimes that often gets lost as we try to put certain people or different companies into different boxes. And so I would say keep the creativity. I would also say keep in mind the fact that the strategy is something that needs to be linked back, and don't lose track of that. And again, that's why that enterprise architecture is such a good, to me, it's really important, because it basically says, hey, strategy is linked to this thing all the way through. And as you point out, it's like the risk in the life cycle. That's another issue to me that as we go through, If you do this stuff for a living, then I'm sure what happens is that you go, oh my God, this is something that can go wrong. As you go through, be careful here because this is one of those things. And a lot of times that's a lot, part of the life cycle that people are aware of because they've been through it and they've seen things go wrong. Even though, you're looking at it and you're monitoring things and you're being careful, but it's still that things can go wrong. Use the data that you can. I think a lot of times people don't take into account all the data or don't look at all the data. And so this whole notion of exhaust data becomes important. What data does a company have that I could use potentially to help them choose the right system or help them implement the right system or know that they're implementing the system now or find out that there's nothing going wrong at this point in time? What do I need to monitor in terms of what that data is so that I can continuously understand what's going on in terms of this implementation and keep that perspective? So those would be some of the issues that I would think about. The creativity, the constantly monitoring, the time to the strategy, things like that.
Well said. That is excellent. Great advice. And the idea of creativity is so powerful for individuals and organizational growth. Well said. Dr. OLeary, thank you so much for your time today. This has been so fun. We truly appreciate your expertise, experience, and insight. You've been a mentor and supporter of my own research and dissertation work, and I'm really, truly delighted to have you share your work and experience with our listeners today. So thank you very much. Thanks again, and be well.
Thank you for the opportunity to be here and to talk about this. It's always a kick to talk about some of these things.
Jack, that was an amazing conversation.
It sure was, Jonathan. So much fun. Please join us in our next episode as we discuss the value of business intelligence, understanding and measuring operational issues with Mr. Tim Van Meegem. Mr. Van Meegem is a partner of the ProAction Group, an operational consulting firm which he founded in 1995 with his colleagues. Tim has 30-plus years of experience helping middle-market companies identify, quantify, and mine latent value. He is widely recognized for his expertise in supply chain functions as the author of a book, Implementing Supplier Partnerships, presenting at national and local conferences, and creating numerous articles on value creation, sourcing, and logistics. In addition, he created the firm's proprietary 9-box inventory and pricing tool, which has helped countless companies optimize their inventory levels and improve their pricing practices. Please join us again next week for another great conversation.
Listeners, thank you for joining us on today's episode. We are incredibly excited and grateful to have friends, colleagues, and mentors join us on our podcast. We have an incredible lineup of guests, including ERP and organizational change speakers, authors, professors, researchers, pioneers in the field, practitioners, PE partners, business executives, ERP vendors, and organizational stakeholders. We invite you to leave us feedback and a review because we want to make this the most useful and insightful podcast you listen to, and we need your help to do so.
Thank you, listeners, for being with us again this week as we seek to 1, promote, connect, and foster relationships in the ERP organizational change community, 2, contribute to the field of ERP organizational change, and 3, bring research and practice closer together. Please join us again next week as we discuss the latest ERP organizational change research, practice, and stories. Our podcast will draw on knowledge from extensive research, collaborative learning, and practitioner expertise and experience. Hashtag the ERP Organizational Change Journal.
From everyone here on the team, Jack and myself, we wish you a great week, and we hope to see you again soon on another episode. Bye for now.